What is the heat load on a mile-long driveway?
I have no idea. I mean, I did look at the numbers a little bit. I was trying to figure out like how much it would be, and it's something like, it really depends on your electricity rates, and you know what kind of system you're using. But
and if you have a nuclear reactor on site. Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, a weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Deputy Editor Matt Milham.
How's it going?
Fine Homebuilding Editorial Director Brian Pontalillo.
Hey, Patrick.
And producer extraordinaire Jeff Rose.
Hi there.
Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Well, fellas, it is great to see you. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you also.
What have you guys been doing? Brian, have you built a desk?
I haven't done anything, Patrick. And you know, now I've been on the podcast more consistently, and you ask that question every week.
You got to do some stuff.
I feel really lame, so hopefully I'll have a better answer for you next week.
How about you, Matt? What have you been doing?
Mostly working on my disc golf game. That's probably the main thing. Yeah, no. I did about 30 minutes work on that breezeway cabinet project that I haven't touched since spring. But yeah, I got to get going on that.
How about your wood shop? I'm curious, have you made any progress in making a usable workspace?
Yes and no. I mean, I've cleared some stuff out. I've mostly reassembled, I should say, the table saw, but there's not really enough space in my garage to like actually use all that stuff without moving a bunch of other stuff out. So fortunately I did get the lawn tractor out of there. But
what did you do with it? That's something I'm facing currently.
I put it in another shed. But
in your garden shed?
Yeah. Well, no, not the garden shed. There's one off the end of the house that kind of has, usually I use it to store, like the pressure washer, generator, snowblower, all that stuff. But now the generator and snowblower are out of there to be ready for use. But the snowblower is in the garage, the generator's out back. So, it's like some stuff out, some stuff in.
I was moving stuff around in here. The last couple of days I've been building a cabinet. And do you guys remember those cheap games as a kid, when you had the little tiles, you had to slide the things in the right order to get the number and the right sequence or make a face or whatever? And I felt like that when I was trying to get stuff moved around in here today. How about you, Jeff? What have you been doing?
Nothing home related, house related,
Yeah. I think this is the time of year when a lot of folks want to do other stuff, and you ordinarily would go visit with family and do these other things, but it's still that time of year. I've been trying to carve out enough time to make this cabinet. Can you guys see back there? So there's the cabinet, and then there's a bunch of drawer parts over there. I think I probably have at least 8 hours invested in this dumb little cabinet that's 27 inches wide with 3 drawers in it.
What's taking you so long?
Making drawer parts takes forever, man. It's I think each piece gets 5 operations, right? So it takes a ton of time. But I have upped my game. This is the first cabinet I built with my new Freud Dado set. This is what you get when you grow up and you want to do some woodworking, right?
Yeah. Are you running that on your DeWalt table saw, or what do you have?
No, so that one only takes a 6-inch. And I will tell folks, if you're trying to decide if a 6-inch is worth getting for your little saw, they work fine. The one I bought was only $40. So the problem with it is the grooves or dados it makes are not completely flat on the bottom. So you spend some time futzing around with a chisel to level it out, or you just are okay with it not being perfect. But this thing cuts really flat dados, and because it's bigger, it's better balanced. And to answer your question, man, I'm sorry. It goes on the SawStop portable.
Okay. I do run that 8-inch. I do run that 8-inch stack on my DeWalt.
I don't think you're supposed to.
Oh no, you're not supposed to. I think it says to run a max 6-inch, but I was I'm getting the 8-inch because I'm not going to buy 2 sets because I'm going to get a better table saw one day.
You can use it on your cabinet saw now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So then you have, of course, you have to buy the throat plate, and This is not a normal Delta style. You had this, like, you can't make your own really. I mean, if you were crazy, you could, but so that, I don't know, that's probably $40. And then of course you need to get another cartridge to the tune of 80 or 100. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because it's
right,
different shape. But it does a great job. I'm delighted with how it works. I've had it for probably a year. I bought it on sale because they were coming out with a new model, and that was the older one, and I think it was $70 or $80 instead of 100 plus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't remember what I paid for mine. I want to say like 140 or something, but that was 5 years ago, maybe.
It was remarkable, the deal, so I bought it.
Yeah.
Hey, Patrick, let me ask you this, because this has always been a mystery to me, and something I've had to figure out a new method for every time I've made cabinetry.
I'm worried when you're asking me this question, Brian.
well, I guess first of all, what kind of drawer slides are you using? And second of all, what's your method for figuring out the location of the slides inside the cabinet box?
So I do, okay. I have a frugal driven lifestyle. We've talked about it before, right? So
we've heard a lot about it.
I went on Amazon and bought side mount drawer slides. They come from China. I bought a pack of 10 of them, right? For, it would do 5 drawers, and they don't come with screws even, but it was $70. So, you're talking $7 a drawer slide. And they're ball bearing, they're soft close, but they are by no means anything special. Mm-hmm. And I do what people say you shouldn't do, and I put them on the cabinet box. And then I make some kind of fixture, a milk crate with wood on it or whatever, to hold the box level, and then I fasten it with the drawers extended. Does that make sense? I make a stand for the drawer box, extend the slides, because you can't run the screws. You have to otherwise put it on the drawer first, and then put 1 or 2 in the box. You have to start with something in the right plane, right? And to me, it makes more sense to start with the slides in the box on the right plane and make the drawer match it. Because with the slide extended, you can use a combination square or whatever to get it aligned correctly on the side of the box.
So the fussing is getting that drawer positioned on your temporary stand.
Exactly. I've used those quick grip clamps to kind of hold it. And unless you have someone to help you hold the box and line it up, it just doesn't really work. So I use the stand as like the second set of hands that if you had someone to help you, you could do much more easily. Mm-hmm. I could ask Liam to help me, but then we'd have a family argument and everyone would be sad.
Are those slides tight enough to stay parallel when you pull them out like that? Or is there slop and you have to kind of like compensate? Like, does the drawer...
Well, if you make the box the right size, it solves that problem, right? Because it holds the slides parallel.
Well, I mean, parallel to each other, but I mean, if you extend them out, if there's like a little slop, they may sag a little bit when you go to fasten it on the inside of the cabinet.
I haven't had that problem, Matt. Yeah, I'm sure that could happen. And my drawers are pretty heavy. I'm making them out of 3/4 stock, so they're not light.
Yeah. I've made some drawers with some pretty cheap slides, and I've made some drawers with some pretty high quality slides. And in my experience, when you one of the things about upgrading to better slides is that
adjustability.
There's adjustability, but also you have to be precise with your tolerances. Like the tolerances are tight, and I've had a couple of instances where I was off by a very small amount, and the drawer kind of, there was a little bit of bind when you were opening it or closing it.
I would say fault on the size of making the drawer just slightly smaller, because like my slides are a 1/2 inch thick. It makes it very easy. You make your drawer box 1 inch smaller than the case.
Yeah.
Maybe an additional 32nd is not a bad idea, because if it's too tight, then it binds, right?
Right.
Have you made cabinets, Jeff? Do you have any thoughts on this subject?
I've done a few, but I mean, the couple of times that I've done drawer slides, they've been actually exposed. Like right here on my desk, I have a sliding table on my desk that, but it's two separate cabinets, so I was able to fudge everything.
Yeah. I would say it's one of the harder things that a hobbyist carpenter could do is make your own cabinets. But boy, bang for the buck, it is hard to beat.
I find making cabinets to be fun. I like it a lot. I like that work a lot. The highest, but the hardware is where I get the most stress from. Locating the drawer slides and door hinges and all that stuff is where I find the process to be the most stressful.
Drawer boxes are way harder than regular cabinet boxes, right? So, wall cabs are easy in comparison to base cabinets because, most base cabinets have at least one drawer.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm using cheap plywood from the Orange Box store. I think it was $35 a sheet, and it comes from South America. It's radiata pine. What I like about it is the veneers have very few voids. They are very consistent. So even when you have end grain, it looks kind of cool because you see the glue layers and the veneer layers kind of alternate, and it makes this cool like Baltic birch look, but it costs, a third of what Baltic birch panels costs. But they're not always flat, so you got to make sure you go on the right day and really check the panels because sometimes they get kind of potato chippy from either bad handling or just by their very nature.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of times they just stack that stuff poorly, and so it always ends up with like a bow in it.
And God, I'm going to tell folks now, don't buy those panels because they are just impossible to work with.
No, you're never going to straighten it out.
It just doesn't work. Yeah, you can't straighten it out. And it makes every operation so much harder. Mm-hmm. How do you make a consistent groove in a board that's warped?
I've seen some really dynamite looking, you mentioned the exposed plies, Patrick, and I've seen some really dynamite looking cabinetry where the plies are just left exposed. Sometimes the handles are integral and so sort of European style cabinetry without any edge banding. And I always really like that look, but I wonder how do they get such nice consistent plywood and tool it so perfectly that they have no tear out anywhere, no little imperfections. And maybe I haven't seen these cabinets up close enough. Maybe I'd find the imperfections if I was there. But I like that look a lot. It's a little intimidating to try to build with such precision.
Yeah, I've got a buddy, a guy I went to high school with who does a lot of that kind of stuff, and he uses Baltic birch and a big CNC machine. He's an engineer, and he builds all kinds of stuff with the CNC. And I wish I could do the stuff that he was doing, by hand, because it looks like so great. Like, I don't think he's a professional woodworker. He's an engineer, and this stuff just looks fantastic. But yeah,
in my brief stint as an editor for Fine Woodworking, Justin made this monster miter saw stand out of this plywood with this cool overlay, and it's a Baltic birch plywood underneath. And the stuff is like, I don't know, depending on the color you get, between $200 and $300 a sheet. But that's how you get perfect layers, Brian, is the trees are amazing, and somebody is really, picking through the veneer pieces to make sure it's going to make good plywood.
And I also wonder about finishing those exposed edges. There's got to be a challenge there so that they can actually be smooth and not just soak up all the finish that you're putting on them.
Yeah.
I love that look too. If any of you listening have experience making this kind of stuff we're talking about, I'd love to hear from you about how you do it.
Well, Amy and I were we were debating last night the possibility of buying a house versus upping our lease, which is still a little ways away.
So how many ways away are we talking about?
7 months.
Okay.
So
it takes months to buy a house. So
right. So it's not that far away in terms of starting the process. But now that we want to figure out these exposed edge cabinets, I'm leaning towards buying a house.
I think that is the most practical thing I've heard all day, Brian. Speaking of the big box store, this comes from Eric in Cullahee, North Carolina. I apologize, Eric, if I mispronounce your town's name. It's a pittance for them, but I suspect it will create increasing dollars for homeowners who hire contractors to do this right. So he sent me a story from CBS. Home Depot will pay a fine of more than $20 million after settling with the EPA and the Department of Justice for alleged serious violations of the EPA's lead paint rule. The company will also pay Massachusetts $732,000 as part of the settlement. It's the largest penalty ever paid under the Toxic Substances Control Act, according to federal officials. The agency said Home Depot gave work to subcontractors that in some cases did not use lead-safe practices or do required post-renovation cleaning, among other violations. There were also instances where Home Depot did not make sure contractors performing renovations were properly trained in lead safety. How about that? $20 million.
Yeah.
Well, I guess this answers the question that we were all asking many years ago when the lead paint rules were put into place about how it's going to be enforced, because you certainly don't see it see that those rules being enforced on many common residential painting sites. So maybe this is their approach to go after sort of
Moby Dick.
Yeah.
Right? You go after the big guy.
That are contracting lots of work and not ensuring that it's followed.
My guess is that some attorneys were involved in deciding in who to pursue in this litigation, wouldn't you think?
Yeah.
Probably. I just wonder if any of that is going to get passed down to the contractors that they were working with, or is Home Depot just going to eat all of that? Not that it's a lot of money to them, but
that's a good question, Matt. I don't know that. So you think you're suggesting that Home Depot might charge the contractors to pay for these bills that they got from the EPA?
Yeah.
I don't know. That seems like going to be tough to get money from Home Depot subcontractors, if I had to guess.
I would think so. I mean, it would probably cost more in litigation trying to get that all settled than just paying out the $20 million. But
I think most folks would agree with me when I'm going to guess that those contractors aren't making a ton of money subcontracting for Home Depot in the first place. I bet they don't have big bank accounts, is my guess.
Yeah.
These rules are pretty strict and certainly add a lot of complexity to a job. We covered this in an article when these rules were relatively new, so we can include that in the show notes. But if nothing else, even for the non-pro, they give you some pretty good ideas about how to work safely when you're working with lead paint.
And you should.
Yeah. I mean, I looked through some of the rules, and I mean, a lot of it is just stuff that, a lot of our authors already kind of do.
Just to protect the house.
Just to protect the rest of the house from dust in general. So,
right.
They're not if you're using those kinds of practices to begin with, then it's probably not going to be that much more onerous to go by the lead safe rules.
Yeah, maybe it adds more complexity outside than inside, compared to typically what a restoration carpenter or painter might do in terms of exterior setup.
Yeah,
absolutely. And if you're running on tight margins, that kind of cleanup and setup at the beginning and end of the day, that's a significant chunk of time, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the temptation is to skip on that stuff, but it can burn you.
To $20 million.
Woo, that's a lot of money. Hey, FHB team, in episode 309, you were talking about humidity and an HRV. At sub 40% humidity, I believe you should be running the humidifier. Yes, the HRV and humidifier work against each other, but with that way of thinking, so does your HRV and furnace, yet we don't turn off our furnace. Each one is accomplishing a separate task to balance a different element of comfortable and healthy environment. I recommend listening to Building HVAC Science episode number 48 to learn about the effects of low humidity on our health. Love listening to everyone. Thank you, Dan. So I listened to a big chunk of this podcast, which is hosted by a gentleman, Bill Spawn, I believe is how you say his name. And his podcast is dedicated to high performance HVAC. And one of the cool things about podcasts now is no matter what esoteric interest you have, there is a podcast for your very personal self. And I'm guessing some of you are identifying right now what you listen to. Anyway, so I listened to part of this, and this woman who is an architect and an MD, and I believe also an engineer, has researched the effect of indoor air quality in hospitals, namely like sampling and seeing what's in there. And she has demonstrated that when you go below 40%, people are more likely to get infections in the hospital. And I mean, I think it's unfair to extrapolate that to indoor home air, right? They're very different and the environment is different, but it was very interesting. And I'll put a link to that podcast on our podcast page for those of you who want to geek out on HVAC, because it's going to be right up your alley.
Yeah, I think I listened to part of that episode, and mostly I was just trying to find the part where they were getting to the humidity talk, and it sounded like she was saying that, this really does apply to all buildings. A lot of these studies early on were done in hospitals, but they're finding the same thing regardless of the type of building, that it's a matter of drying out of mucous membranes and creating like an environment inside your body where pathogens can more likely take hold and infect you. So
she has an interesting background, right, Matt?
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah, she just got curious about other things. Like she had gone to medical school, and then she got, curious about some other stuff. And so she got a master's in architecture. And yeah, it's just really interesting how
she helps hospitals like build hospitals, right? That's her area of expertise.
Yep.
What do you think about this, Brian? Haven't we learned in the building science community that, isn't high indoor humidity more of a problem than low?
I think that typically the advice that I've seen given is not to humidify houses. In most cases, that is not a great idea. But to this topic of health and indoor air quality, it's largely not studied well at least in the residential environment, and so I do think it's I do think it's an area that needs a lot more research, and then actionable outcomes, because you can use like Google Scholar, and you can find a lot of studies about indoor air quality, VOCs, and correlation to and other things in correlation to health issues. They tend to lack sort of actionable advice, So I think maybe there's got to be some synthesis of these kinds of academic studies and building scientists, to come up with sort of actionable advice for architects and builders who are working on homes.
And with regard to, indoor air quality in hospitals, I maintain that's a different animal than houses, because, you have years of sick people in this building, and they are going to spread their pathogens, and, you can't clean everywhere. You can't clean out ductwork. So, I think it's just a bad environment for, pathogens, or, a good environment for pathogens, depending on how you look at it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the issue is that if you're let's say you live in a house that's really dry, and, you have dry skin, chapped lips, dried out mucous membranes, and then you go to the grocery store, you still have those conditions in your body, it doesn't immediately recover. And then, you get sick, you bring it home. Everybody else in your house is,
more susceptible.
Is more susceptible. And so, you're spreading this thing around. But I think the high humidity thing, not wanting to humidify your house, I think that's more of an issue of the effects on the house and, leading to mold that then lead to health problems for people. But, so really it's if you build a house out of something different, if you don't have, basically food for mold to grow on, then you probably wouldn't have those problems. So, I don't think everybody's going to go out and build a concrete house, and I certainly wouldn't advocate for that. But, you have to have a combination of temperature and humidity, or water and food, for this stuff to grow. So, it's not always a problem to humidify, but depending on what your house is made out of, it certainly can be a problem.
And your wall assembly, right?
Exactly.
This comes from Jim in Northern California. I escaped California a few years ago after my county became a major growing area. Typically, once a house has been used as a grow house, it has to have the drywall removed and a full mold remediation done before it's habitable. After an entire season of being held at 80 or 90 degrees and nearly 100% humidity, the walls are covered in mold that extends deep into the drywall. A seller can mask this with a few coats of paint, but it'll come back with a serious assault until a serious assault is done on it. Also, these growers only care about money and often use excessive amounts of toxic chemicals to force the growth, and they don't have much concern about spillage or cleanup. Often this means the floors need to be removed, which is problematic when it's a slab. When the sheriff raids them, they go in wearing full hazmat garb for a good reason. Put as much distance between you and a grow house as you can. I forget what episode we were talking about. Someone had just bought a former grow home.
It was just a couple episodes ago.
Yeah.
Great, so he's got some surprises waiting for him.
Yeah.
Underneath those freshly painted walls.
But it was such a bargain, honey.
Yeah.
I think I knew that intuitively, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it stands to reason.
Seems problematic.
You know, plants want to be outside. When you bring them inside, you know, there's other stuff that goes with. What's this next one? Okay, this is a good question. This is Randal from Facebook. I've gotten a lot of good advice from you folks regarding the perfect wall, air sealing, vapor barriers, and wall insulation, but how about the perfect roof? Did I miss that article? I'd like to see more on roof insulation, combining cavity fill and continuous exterior insulation. Can you direct me to those articles? Thanks. Do we have these articles?
Yeah, we certainly do. But first, just a comment. If he's referring to the quote unquote perfect wall, like Joe Stiebrick's perfect wall, then then he should also understand that is also Joe Stiebrick's perfect roof.
Right, the walls go up onto
and
the
his perfect
roof.
slab, and you just turn that assembly in different directions. It's a bit more challenging to put the bulk of or all of your insulation outside of a roof if you need to hit R49 or higher.
And you don't need to.
But that in theory, the perfect wall assembly is meant to be the perfect assembly, just kind of with slight variations made to it. But yeah, we have articles, especially if you head to GBA. We have two sort of really excellent articles by Martin. One that's how to build an insulated cathedral ceiling, which will give you all the kind of tools that you need.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Martin goes through several assemblies in that piece, right?
Well, the first one. No, he sort of gives you all the tools to design your own assembly, and then the second article is 5 insulated roofs that work. And that one, he gives you examples of different assemblies that work and how to sort of adjust them for different climates.
I thought that article was extremely valuable. That is definitely one to check out.
Yeah, and if you read that first article, that's probably 10 years old now and still absolutely relevant. If you read that first article a few times and understand it, you can, everything you need is there to really understand how to do an insulated roof. And it's a tricky assembly and one that you want to get right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's lots of options there, from exterior insulation, vented, unvented, just all the different materials that can possibly use, and everything can work one place or another, one way or another.
You just have to think about it as the assembly. You can't like mix and match from parts of other roofs and put them together in your own hybrid. That's when you get into trouble. Right.
What's really interesting about roofs and sort of I think one of the kind of lesser used techniques, but one that is being used more and more in warmer climates, are the insulated roofs insulated with fibrous insulation, fiberglass or cellulose or mineral wool, and then they have a vapor diffusion port at the ridge, which is similar to a ridge vent, except that it's meant to let vapor out. And this is a code accepted, IRC accepted roof assembly that sort of solves the problem of
ridge rot.
Yeah, ridge rot in a fibrous insulated roof line.
But you can only do this in a couple climate zones, as I recall.
It works best in warmer climate zones, yeah.
It's wacky to me. It's wacky. Do you guys think this? I mean, it's been researched, but it's not exactly researched how to build it. It looks weird.
Well, I mean, Building Science Corporation has done some research on it. I think they were doing it pretty much all over. I think they did it in Alaska as well as Florida, and it seemed to work in a bunch of different places.
I'm going to wait for the movie. Hi, FHB crew. I'm a fairly experienced weekend warrior and regular taker of architecture classes at my local community college, and I very much appreciate the education I've received over the years from the podcast and magazine. It's always fun in class to throw out the occasional, "Don't you guys read Fine Homebuilding?" and bask in the brief but satisfying superiority that accompanies that statement. So thanks for that as well. I've now gotten bored enough to rip up my front just above the ground level deck and reconfigure it. I would like to do a heated tile section extending approximately 10 by 15 in front of the door so I won't have to shovel snow anymore, but I'm finding very limited options. I would be framing out the deck structure about 1 foot above ground, rather stoutly, and then tiling with a method I read about at JLC, shown here, tiling a deck. Okay, so let's talk about snow melting and sidewalks and driveways. And this is something that people do, right?
Yeah.
Do you have this, Matt? Have you considered running a loop from your boiler out into your driveway?
No, I haven't. I mean, I worked on a house once and it had a driveway that was at least a quarter mile long, and they wanted to have this on their driveway in the Catskills.
What is the heat load on a mile-long driveway?
I have no idea. I mean, I did look at the numbers a little bit. I was trying to figure out like how much it would be, and it's something like, it really depends on your electricity rates, and what kind of system you're using. But
and if you have a nuclear reactor on site,
right? Yeah, but I mean, it could be, maybe 25 cents, 30 cents or so per 100 square feet per hour or something like that, if you were using some sort of resistive mat, which doesn't sound like a lot of money. It sounds like it might be worth it if you're paying, I don't know, 60, 70 bucks for a plow to do your driveway. It's certainly a deal.
Folks in Vermont did this. And I would occasionally hear about it. I didn't hang out with these folks very often, but they do the whole driveway, and that's a big deal in Vermont because you're melting perhaps feet of snow at a clip.
Mm-hmm. Do you have to have that thing turned on like well in advance for it to actually do its job? I mean, does it keep up with the kind of snow loads that you get? I mean, if you're getting 4 feet in a day or two.
Like I said, I wasn't running in the same circles as the folks who had these systems, sadly.
Yeah.
But,
did they also have it on their roofs at the eaves?
Yeah.
I've seen more and more of that over the past couple decades.
Yeah.
Do you think that's solving ice damming, allegedly?
I think that's the idea. Maybe solving ice damming, maybe keeping snow from sliding off of the roofs where it's unwanted. I'm not sure, but I've seen those, those cables that are installed out above the roof. That sort of zigzag pattern along the eave.
Yeah, you would see a lot of that. You still see a lot of that in the Catskills. And another thing they do is just metal roofing at like the bottom 2 feet of the roof and then shingles the rest of the way up, which is always funny to me. But
it seems to help because that metal gets heated by the sun much more readily than the asphalt, and it does seem to shed that snow in some buildings I've seen. It works sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
In certain snowy, cold places, people often describe ice damming as a building science failure, and oftentimes it is. Probably most times it is. But if you live in the right place, you get amounts to glaciers on your house because the snowfall and cold temperatures mean that it accumulates more than it's melting because the days are short. It's very cold. It just doesn't melt. So I think the cables are sometimes a solution for that. If you build the right roof, it doesn't matter if it stores snow and ice. But if you have a bad roof, you need to get it off somehow. And there are a ton of folks that I knew, and myself included, who would have a snow rake, which when people hear about that, they're kind of baffled. But it's a long T-shaped thing on a pole that you pull the snow off occasionally to clear the roof.
Yep.
Fun, right, Matt?
Yeah, my dad, they just sold their house, last month, I guess. And that was one of his least favorite chores, was raking off the roof, because they lived in the Adirondacks and they got tons of snow. And yeah, he'd had enough. Now they live in an apartment where all that's taken care of for him.
I don't blame him. Jeff, do you have to shovel your eaves on the backside of the house?
I couldn't if I wanted to.
Because it's so high.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can buy extensions for the snow rake, man. I used to sell them at the hardware store. You can get that sucker up to like 40 feet.
Yeah, but I'd have to stand 80 feet from the house to get the angle.
Yeah.
The important part when it's really long is to not let it get completely off the eave, because getting it up there in the first place is pretty hard.
Yeah. My uncle used to, because he also lived in the Adirondacks, and he used to go up on a ladder because he had a 2-story old house that was built in the late 1800s, I think, and he would just go up there. And this is a guy, he lost a leg when he was 13 above the knee, so he would climb up a ladder with his fake leg and rake snow off the roof, and he fell off one day a few years ago, and I think my dad found him or something,
Man,
in a pile of snow on the ground. So it's dangerous. It's not a thing you want to be doing. And you can pull snow down on yourself if you're just using the rake normally. So
let's get back to this tile section in front of the door. Now, admittedly, this is not a driveway. It's 10 by 15. But I think this is kind of crazy. What do you guys think?
I thought so too. I mean, the article that he is referencing is a JLC article by, I think, Kim Catwick is how you say his name. But he's in the Pacific Northwest, and they don't really get a lot of snow up there. And, while that might be a decent assembly for a place where you're not getting a lot of freeze thaw.
Or any,
it seems like a terrible idea to me to have tile exposed like that, especially because in this guy's method, they're not grouting. So, he's just kind of pushing the tiles close together, which, they're never perfect. So you're going to get water in there, and it's going to freeze. If it pools, then it's going to, pop those tiles right off, and it's not going to last very long. Now, I mean, the option is, of course, leaving that heating mat on
all the time
so that this isn't an issue, but I don't think you want to do that.
You'll go broke.
Yeah.
There's it reminded me of some, and I wish I could think of who was making them, but I couldn't. But it reminded me of a product I saw at the Builders Show a few years back that was a thin paver system for decks. And so it was like a plastic grid system that you fastened to the deck framing, and then you set these thin pavers. And so they were just laid in there, I believe. And I wonder if that would be an option for someone who really did want a different surface than wood for part of their deck. I've never seen it used. I just remember seeing it at the show.
Yeah.
When I say I have little experience in this, I would say I have none. But I did watch, ski lodges being built, and of course, outdoor snow melting is a reasonable thing, I think, for a ski lodge, right? Because people, can't fall when they're coming into the building, and it snows all the time, and you're wearing plastic boots that are, it makes sense in that situation. And they would insulate like you would if you were pouring a slab in a cold place, with a conditioned building. And they would put radiant tubing, hydronic, in there and make a heated outdoor patio, right? And I think if you want to do this, I think you kind of got to go that way. I think the electric stuff, I don't know if any of that's made for outdoors. You'd have to talk to the respective manufacturers, but I don't know. I'm not going to endorse this today.
Yeah. What are you running that then? Some sort of antifreeze? You can't run just water.
Yeah, I think they put glycol in it, Matt.
Patrick, I worked on a commercial building that had an electric system, and I didn't have anything to do with putting that system in, so I don't know what it was, but I know it was an electric system that heated a stone patio outside the door, which was interesting because it was also under a roof. So I don't know if it was if it was for comfort or what it was for. Yeah. It didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, but that brings up another option for this gentleman, which is to build a roof.
Right.
Design a roof into your deck.
And way more practical, right?
Yeah, and fun.
Yeah.
And you're going to have a nicer space.
Right.
Well, that's a darn good idea. I should have you on the show more often, Brian. Dear FHB crew, the boards on my 56 by 16 foot deck are in need of replacement. The rest of the deck is in okay shape, and I'd like to avoid a full rebuild right now. It would be ideal if I could resurface the deck DIY and get another 10 years out of it before the structure needs to be replaced. However, I foresee a few problems and would appreciate your thoughts on my solutions. Problem number 1. The tops of the joists are split and rotted at the butt joints, leaving nothing for new fasteners to grab onto. Solution 1. Sister a 2x4 to each joist in order to provide a nailer for the deck boards. Can both the old board and the 2x4 with 6-inch seal cap both boards, the 2x4 and the old joist with 6-inch wide peel and stick flashing. Problem 2. The deck ledger was never flashed. The vertical tongue and groove cedar siding is sandwiched in between the ledger and rim board. The gaps between the siding and trim were filled with caulk, which is failing. Solution number 2. Remove the existing trim, cut a few inches of siding out, and tack a piece of Z-flashing behind the siding. Tuck a piece of Z-flashing behind the siding, which would go over top of the deck ledger. Unfortunately, I think I'll have to leave the old siding sandwiched between the ledger and the rim board. Problem 3. Several of the footings are covered in soil and the posts are starting to rot at the bottom. Solution 3. Remove the soil, install Simpson RZBP retrofit post bases for added security, optionally cut off the bottom 1 inch of post and install a plastic spacer to separate the post from the concrete. Is this a reasonable plan? Thanks, Josh. Anyone?
Funny, Josh. It doesn't sound like your deck's in great shape.
Yeah, man.
Josh, there's problems with every part of your deck.
Yeah, his questions are a little bit out of order, I think. Like, the first thing I would want to do is check behind that ledger and make sure that, there isn't rot,
It's a bad assembly.
Yeah, so you got to get either, if you can, see the condition of that rim and the ends of the joists from the basement, that's ideal. If not, maybe you have to take down some drywall, or maybe you can drill some holes with a hole saw, through the ledger into the inside, just to make sure that it's not like a worm farm back there.
I'm gonna go out on a limb here and suggest that there's probably some rot back there.
Yeah, I would think so, especially if he says, the caulk is failing.
The siding is rotting.
Yeah. So, you're going to have much bigger problems, much more expensive problems than resurfacing a deck if that is rotten. So.
Oh, and it's supremely dangerous, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't even think you need to worry about resurfacing this thing until you've gotten that figured out. And then if there aren't problems, then you have to, I don't know. If that's okay, would you be comfortable just flashing back to, I don't know, the next layer of siding, or what? What would you do?
Are you asking me individually as Patrick, or is it like a building science?
It's a building
head?
Science guy. Either of you, anybody.
I don't know. This is a question that I feel pretty. I don't want to answer really this question, but
wait a minute. Why don't you want to answer for starter?
Because we're talking about some pretty potential for some pretty serious structural issues on a pretty big deck, man. That thing,
it's huge.
56 feet is, I'm assuming, long, which means it's running,
16 feet deep
and 16 feet deep. So that's running along 56 feet potentially of the house. Maybe it extends beyond the house. I don't know, but that's a long.
It looks like it wraps a corner.
Okay.
So we got two sides of the house that are involved.
Yeah, nice. I wonder where the right. I'm imagining if the deck was built like this, that because I've seen decks built like this where the ledger is installed right over the siding, and they're often just nailed. The ledger is often just nailed to the house. So I wonder if it's just nailed to the house, if it's nailed, and what length those nails are. There's so many things that I have so many kind of questions about this deck. We did publish a deck upgrade a few years back, I think by Rick Arnold, where he actually cut the deck away from the house, cut the deck from the house, slid it out so that he could retrofit proper flashing, pushed it back in, and salvage the deck framing. I don't know if you could do that with a 56-foot long deck. The one that he worked on
that the
wasn't quite
joists
so
are
long.
rotting, right? You can't move a structure that's rotting.
The joists are rotting. The posts need to be upgraded. Sounds easier to tear it
start
down.
over. And if you don't have the money to do all of it now, build a smaller deck and then add to it. A deck is an easy thing to add to. Ask me how I know. That's what I do on the weekends. I'll be honest. I've never taken a deck apart to replace it where I didn't find rot behind the ledger, because for decades we were not teaching people how to do it correctly, or people were not paying attention. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, decks are a relatively new addition to the code. They weren't there forever. And so, people were just kind of winging it for a very long time.
And I've said this before on the show, it was often billed as like a DIY project at the home center, right? You pick up the little pamphlet, you buy a bunch of material from the racks, and you go home and have at it. There was never any like connection details for the house or the posts or anything. Guardrail connections were all kind of on the fly.
Yeah. So I'll throw this out there. If he does decide to keep this deck and work with it, at a minimum, beef up the connections between the ledger and the house. If it's nailed, add bolts or structural screws, add those lateral load connectors. At least be at a minimum, beef up that connection to make sure that, you're not setting the deck up for catastrophic failure.
Look inside. If you have access or make access to see the backside of the band joist at an absolute minimum, and I would do that before I went out there anymore, right? If the thing is rotting, you shouldn't be hanging out there.
Right.
Yeah, throwing good money after bad.
Check your decks, folks. I've been telling Liam when he goes to college or whatever he does, hangs out with groups of people, do a once-over of the deck before you decide to go out there, because they do fail when you get a bunch of people on them sometimes, right?
Yeah. Yeah, especially in the kind of housing stock that students live in. The worst houses in every college town.
So the first contractor that I worked for started, he was in a fraternity in college, and he started his business repairing drywall in all the frat houses after parties. And that was it. That was where he started, and he had been a contractor since.
Do you think he's still working for his classmates and college brothers?
He
Right?
might be. We were still repairing drywall.
He still goes back to Delta House to fix the drywall. Jeff, what do you think about this? You're a very practical and handy person. Like, what would you do?
I mean, I would be very reluctant to try and remanufacture that without knowing what's going on deep down. Definitely needs a lot of steel thrown at it, looking at the underside of that.
So, sage advice from Jeff Rose. I would believe him before any of us. Hello to the wonderful folks of the FHB podcast. I've been an avid listener to the show for a couple years now. I started listening while working in St. Thomas as a construction site supervisor / project coordinator for a nonprofit. We rebuilt roofs and homes after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, while also living on a Caribbean island, which wasn't so bad. I'm a mathematician and physicist by degree, engineer by title, and closeted building science nerd. A coworker of mine just moved into a brand new apartment complex here in Kansas City that is claimed to be the largest passive house building in the world. After seeing the apartment, it is quite impressive. I was helping him bring a TV in the other day and completely nerded out on the building. It has 16-inch thick exterior walls with 4-inch concrete, 16-inch continuous foam insulation, and 6 inches of concrete, triple glazed windows, ERV, solar. The nerd list goes on and on. The rent on a one-bedroom is $1,500 a month, which is almost identical to a building adjacent that isn't passive. This makes me wonder, is there a significant untapped economy of scale when it comes to building passive? Anyway, thought it was worth sharing and maybe worth a discussion of why we aren't seeing more of these multifamily passive houses. Keep fighting the good fight, Nate. So, Brian, I'm sure you have heard about more multifamily passive structures than any of us. What is your experience from the GBA world with these, bigger buildings?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's, and I don't have any data to back this up, but I think that there's probably more um, energy efficient, sustainable, green kind of building happening in commercial, municipal, institutional construction than there is residential construction. You see it quite a bit, not just passive house, but LEED certification and other programs. And so I do think that there's a lot of it when it comes to the passive. When it comes to passive house strategies, I think, for one thing, I think they're better suited for bigger buildings than smaller buildings. And I don't know enough about this to maybe articulate it clearly, but because it's a measure of energy per square foot or energy per volume that passive house is based on, that it tends to shine. The bigger the building is, the more that standard tends to shine. In fact, I was working with a builder who builds, is passive house certified builder and builds passive houses kind of when requested by his clients. But he basically told me that exact thing. Like, we recommended for bigger projects, and smaller projects, it doesn't really make sense. We can build, we can value engineer an efficient building without using that standard and save people money and have just as efficient of a building. And it's a building that's not going to use as much energy anyway. So not necessarily worth putting all that effort into it. And then, of course, there's economies of scale, right? Anything that like that's done on a larger scale is going to, bring costs down. So
what do you think?
I think it's great that building's there and that he got to experience it.
What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, there's economies of scale with with any kind of multifamily. I mean, every individual unit is heating less. I mean, you may only have one wall that, goes to the outside. At the most, you may have 3 or 4, you may have 4, but it's unlikely if you're in an apartment building that you're going to have, you may have a front and back that are exposed,
Mm-hmm.
but, you may end up with 3 if you're on the roof, or if you're the top floor, maybe you're also, having to insulate there. But yeah, I mean, it's just a fact that there's economies of scale, with any kind of multifamily. The reason that we don't see a lot of it is because that's not what people want. I mean, the American dream is, single family living. I think that's the main thing, for people moving into cities or people who, want to move to a city. I don't think there's a lot of those people right now. Everybody seems to be going the opposite direction, but, there may be more people looking for that kind of thing, but it's just not really happening that I see, and it's just a lack of demand, I think.
I think we're talking about, when you're talking about multifamily, you're talking about either not-for-profits or developers. And in both cases, they want maximum, in the case of the developer, profit, and in the case of the nonprofit, cost effectiveness, right? So if it's going to cost a ton more to make a passive house than you save in energy costs, and, if you're talking about private development, it's almost always the tenants who are paying the energy bills. So I would argue they have very little incentive to make a better envelope for their tenants because they're not paying the bills and they can build more cheaply, more conventionally, I'm guessing.
Yeah. But I mean, there's so much other stuff that goes into this. I mean, passive houses take a lot of resources typically to build. You're putting a lot more sort of like front loading carbon a lot more into one of those buildings than you are like a conventional code built house. So, it's there, depending on how you're building this house, if you're not using materials that either, are carbon neutral or sequester carbon, you can end up sort of, worsening the climate crisis at the front end at the hope of making it, ameliorating it on the back end. And, that's not necessarily a good strategic move right now. So you have to be really thoughtful when you're building one of those buildings.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Matt. And so that motivation or that intention is really important. And there's so many different reasons why you might choose to build a high performance building, right? From lower cost to comfort. I think that's going to be one of the things that's going to drive high performance buildings is when homeowners start to realize how comfortable these buildings are to be in, these homes are to be in. And then there's climate issues, right? And climate scientists, have kind of made the case for these next 10 years being the most important. So long-term energy efficiency is now is of course still important, but um, the carbon impact in the first year is ultimately maybe a bigger decision for a climate-minded builder
Yeah.
these days.
Yep.
I'm not a big proponent of passive house. I see its value. I think it's interesting, but I I can't see in most places where you benefit from the additional cost. Yeah, you want a comfortable building, but it doesn't have to be a passive house, right?
No, and I think often what I think the benefit of programs is it's education. We work with so many builders who have built passive houses, are passive house certified, have built lead houses, are lead certified. Use all of these programs. Many people, what you see is that they don't use the programs anymore unless the client wants it. Instead, they've learned from the programs. They learned how to do this work from the program, from using these programs. They've learned the building science principles, the building techniques. They've learned about products, materials, mechanicals, all these aspects of building a high performance home, and now they can apply it without using the program.
Yeah.
To more mainstream projects, I think it would be tough to argue that passive house is to some degree either because people are motivated for their environmental ethics or their personal ethics or whatever, but there's more to it than just simply making an energy efficient house. And I think some folks, it's a vanity situation where they want to have something that their neighbors don't have. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that inherently, but as you suggest, Brian, there are many motivations for wanting a passive house. Is it to be the most efficient with carbon now or later, or is it the most energy smart? I don't think so.
You don't think that's the motivation for most people?
I don't. Because if you look at it from a carbon perspective, I think in many cases you're consuming more than you're saving, and as Matt says on the front end. If the building is in service for 100 years or 50 years, maybe that metric changes, but how many of our houses are going to be around 100 years from now?
Yeah, chances are it's going to be modified. It may not even still be standing. And, if you front loaded all of that, chances are, I don't want to say chances are, but I mean, you're making it more likely that, that kind of super insulated house is something that you're going to really want in the future, and you're not going to be heating it. You're going to be cooling it.
Yeah, I think we could expect that. So there are folks who do passive houses with only like cellulose insulation, right? Do you guys see that as a better alternative? Is that less carbon hoggy?
Yeah, and that's why I say when if you're choosing materials that are either carbon neutral or carbon sequestering, like it's using materials like that instead of using
foam.
6 inches of rigid foam or
mineral wool
or any of these other things that are require a lot of energy,
huge inputs.
Yeah,
they're pretty. I mean, in some cases they're tough decisions. If in terms of like choosing an insulation. I know, for example, if you want to use the most climate sensitive insulation, you're going to use cellulose or straw, right, or something natural like that, or wood fiber, something that, to Matt's point, sequesters carbon. Some people might argue that mineralable bats are a great choice because they're so easy to reuse. That they'll have this long life, but they obviously have a greater carbon impact right off the get go. But when you start to get into foam products,
it's off the chart.
It's the carbon footprint starts to skyrocket, and really unless you're in a you need them for some sort of problem solving situation. I mean, don't even need them below grade anymore. Like you can use mineral wool below grade, you know, so there's options.
Do you think the Gutex type wood fiber insulations are a solution to these problems? Have they been demonstrated to have less carbon inputs on in their manufacturing?
I believe so. I don't know a ton about their manufacturing, but I believe so. Yeah, and they're made with byproducts, right? So there's that aspect of it, and they're a wood product, and that's a carbon sequestering material.
What do you know about these things, Matt?
I think we talked a little bit about it probably, I don't know, a year ago or something like that, when, you know, we were talking about trees being cut down specifically for Gutex, and, you know, like the amount of like wood waste that's like in the soil and all that, and like trying to figure out what the actual balance is there, you know, in terms of like, you know, how much carbon is either being left in the soil because you're leaving, you know, the roots and everything behind, and how much, you know, if that gets converted to say methane or something like that, depending on the environment in which they're harvesting these trees. So I don't know that it's been studied deeply enough yet to really know whether or not, you know, like if it is simply a matter of using waste wood that wouldn't be used for anything else, like, you know, you're taking all the sawdust from a sawmill, and instead of turning it into wood pellets for somebody's pellet stove, you're turning it into insulation. That it clearly is a much better use of the product. But if you're cutting down forests, you know,
and then shipping them across the Atlantic,
and then saying like that's carbon sequestering, like a tree is carbon sequestering, and it would continue to grow if you didn't cut it down. So, you know, like you've sort of like stopped its carbon sequestering ability by killing it and turning it into insulation.
That's a cheery thought, right?
Yeah. Well, we should soon have the first domestic manufacturer of wood fiber insulation. So we'll see.
In Maine, right, Brian?
In Maine, yeah.
And they have tons of trees in Maine. I've seen them.
Yes, they have tons of trees in Maine, and I think they might be using byproducts from the forest industry. I'm not positive about that, but yeah, they should be online this year if memory serves me right from the last report I heard about them. So
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but is that a European company who set up operations in North America, or is that a new startup here in the U.S.?
It's a startup in the U.S. It's the guys who do the Go Logic homes, and cool. They bought an old paper mill and repurposed it to make wood fiber insulation. So the point is that now builders who want to use wood fiber insulation will at least have the benefit of it not being shipped across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
I've heard people say, though, that shipping is really not that bad with regard to carbon, as far as compared to other means of transportation, of course. But I don't know. I think it makes more sense that trees should come from North America to be used in North American homes.
I think the problem is that it's not just shipped; it's shipped and then trucked. Yeah. So if it's made here, we have to truck it. But if it's not made here, we ship it and truck it.
Right.
So it's in addition to.
I can't see a problem with making stuff in rural Maine, right? It's like people need jobs, and It seems like a good thing. But I've heard a very mixed bag with regard to the mineral wool plant that is being built in West Virginia. You know, folks have very mixed feelings about whether that's a good thing for the local environment and the bigger environment.
Yeah.
Takes a little bit of energy to melt rocks.
Yeah.
I like it as a material.
Oh, I do fantastic.
Too. I mean, if they could find a way to, take the slag immediately after they've, like extracted whatever, iron or whatever they're trying to get out of it and turn it immediately into mineral wool, that would be fantastic. But most of the time they're taking this and then, it's cooling, they're moving it somewhere else and then reheating it and then spinning it into these fibers. So like if they could get it all down in one shot, that would be fantastic. But, that I don't know what it's going to take for that to happen.
Well, I mean, the most popular insulation in the country is fiberglass, and it's using this virtually the same processes, right? I mean, is fiberglass any better with regard to how much energy it takes to make,
I
glass into tiny fibers?
I don't know. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Matt, I'm coming around to your straw bale idea, buddy. Well, so, we've already elapsed an hour of your time, folks who are listening, but it's not going to
let me interrupt you for just a sec.
Go ahead.
Because I just found the chart on my computer, and I'll just briefly, this is a chart that comes from...
Dude, I got nothing else to do today. We can talk all day.
All day long. This is from a white paper written by Chris Magwood at the Endeavor Center in the Builders for Climate Action organization. And I'm looking at the chart right now, and basically, in very broad strokes, here's best insulation to worst insulation when it comes to carbon impacts. Best options are straw bale, hempcrete, cork, dense packed cellulose, wool, and denim bats. So all of those have...
but denim bats don't work. I've heard it said many times. That's not in your study, I bet.
That's not on my chart. So those products all have some carbon sequestering potential, and then things get worse from there with fiberglass, mineral wool, EPS, closed cell with HFO blowing agents, closed cell with HFC blowing agents, and then the worst material by a mile.
Can I guess?
Go for it.
XPS.
Yes.
And that's a shame because it works freaking great.
Yes. There's a story on GBA in the last couple of weeks about some more climate-friendly XPS that has now launched from, I think, a couple of manufacturers. So you can look at that if you want to know if you need to use XPS, a better option.
Polyiso, we've all been told, is the most benign of the foam insulations, but I believe you said EPS comes before polyiso in that chart of yours.
Polyiso was not on the chart. Although it does fall into a closed cell category, doesn't it?
I think so.
I would think
yeah.
So, yeah.
So it might be considered one of those two different types of closed cell foams that basically the difference is the blowing agent that's used. One's a little bit more benign than the other one. You know what a lot of people, a lot of green builders promote is recycled polyiso, because there's tons of it available from being taken off of commercial roofs.
I got it on all over my building, bought tons of it. It was horrible to work with. It was disgustingly dirty, but gosh, what a great use of stuff that was going to be sent to a landfill.
And I will look up and I'll either give some feedback on the next podcast, or we put it on the show notes page. But I'll try to find out a little bit more about that plant in Maine and see if they are actually using virgin material or some sort of industrial byproduct for the wood in the wood fiber. Because, like, to Matt's point, that does make all it's going to make a big difference in how. I think it's still going to be a better material than many, but it does make all the difference in terms of how helpful of a material it is.
Yeah.
These are complicated questions, right? Like, anyone who says they have easy answers, I find immediately untrustworthy, right? Because how can you think of all the variables, right? Where is the house? What is it made of? I mean, like, how long is it supposed to be in service?
Yeah. So that's why the common denominators are things like build smaller, use a little bit less. There's some not common denominators, but some kind of truisms, and go to kind of things that we can do in the building industry if we want to make a difference. Yeah, some simple ways to go forward.
So I have my boss here on the line with us today, and I can thank him for the new thing we're doing with the podcast for 2021, and that's we have a monthly theme. And it so happens that January's first subject is tools and how to use them. So I'm going to ask, it's a pretty big category, folks, so I'm going to ask your help, all of our listeners. If you have a favorite tool, especially one you haven't heard us talk about, I would be so grateful if you would share it with us. And even better, if you can send a picture of yourself wearing a podcast t-shirt while using it.
Also explain how to use it.
So let's go around. I didn't prep you guys. I didn't put this in the script. I'm sorry. But I'm going to ask Jeff. What is one thing once you're like, why did I wait my entire life to get this awesome tool?
I'm going to have to go with the oscillating multi-tool.
Good choice. Matt, do you have a favorite?
Just for something that I reach for all the time is my skew block plane. I just like using that versus a regular straight block plane all the time.
Because it does a better job?
Yeah, it just cuts more easily because, it's essentially like a guillotine. Yeah, instead of just knifing something.
I don't want to ask the dark days about you spent in the Army, buddy, but it seems like it comes out every once in a while. Yeah. Brian, do you have a favorite thing that you wish you would have bought earlier in your life besides your motorcycle?
Routers. Routers, yeah. Just getting comfortable with using routers and learning to use. I have a couple of them and learning to use them more effectively. It just opens up so many possibilities for doing different types of work and doing things that I couldn't do before, couldn't do as easily before. Yeah. But I'm on board with both Jeff and Matt. And also I remember many years back, we published a T&M piece on this little $7 Harbor Freight pull saw. Justin Fink had gotten it and he loved it. And I was actually at a couple of years ago, I was at a Harbor Freight store and I was working doing carpentry work at the time, and I saw that saw, and there was $7. And I remember Justin's review, and I bought it. And it turned just like he said. It turns out that once I had that thing laying around, I found the opportunity to use it almost every day.
Well, that's a good one, especially anything that does a good job and costs $7. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah,
I already talked about earlier in the show about my dado set that upped my game quite a bit. So if you want to start doing joinery with your table saw, buy a good dado set. You can make tenons, you can make grooves, you can make dados. It's just a very useful thing. Rabbets for cabinet backs, all kinds of stuff. Yeah. And if you get a good one, it works. If you don't, it works okay.
You can do bad little box joints like I did on this box when I was practicing for making some other drawers.
So you had the wrong plywood. I don't think it was your dado set, right?
Oh, yeah, this plywood was like little half-inch. I mean, half-inch, sides for drawers is pretty standard, but I don't know that it would be, necessarily with this kind of crappy plywood, which was also orange box store, South American, right? Some kind of weird stuff. It smelled real funny when you cut it.
Yeah, and one of the things I took away from my brief stint at Fine Woodworking is you need to have backup for your cuts. You need zero clearance inserts or tables or auxiliary fences or whatever, so that blade, when it goes through your workpiece, is fully backed on or supported on both sides, or you get lots of tear out, and that is a definite takeaway. And I'm going to let you guys go soon here, but this is another thing. You're never going to imagine how useful these are, but these are a set of little picks that I bought at the hardware store. They come in a set of 4, and I want to say it was less than $10, but I use these constantly. And as you might imagine, I use the pointy one, the straight one, most often for pre-drilling. Like it leaves a good hole that a drill bit can get started so it doesn't walk on, and it's tiny and they're cheap and super useful. So buy those.
And your teeth look great.
You guys have anything to add? Anything you want to tell our listeners?
Thanks for listening.
Yeah,
really.
Enjoy the new year.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Matt, Brian, and Jeff for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Happy building, and keep craft alive.